All right, I'm back. I was kicked out there for a minute when I made Julia co-host. So I think now there will be two videos for this lecture because I see that the one that we were just recording is converting. Anyway, that is the difference between logistic and exponential growth. Just that change in the little b and the little d as population size increases. So that's the bare bones principal difference between those two things. All right, now I have to pull back up our slides here. So we saw in an exponential growth model, we had a B and we had a D, and those were the per capita birth rate and per capita death rate. How many animals each individual in the population is going to give birth to, how many deaths there are per individual animal in the population. And we saw that B minus D in exponential growth was our intrinsic growth rate R, and then 1 plus that is our finite rate of population growth, lambda. Now, we're saying for logistic regression, which includes density-dependent growth and density-dependent death, we're going to use something called B prime and D prime. And what B prime and D prime is the equation of a line, where we have B and D as our intercept. So when the population size is 0, B represents the per capita birth rate. When the population size is 0, D represents the per capita death rate. This is going to be highest when the population equals 0. This is going to be the lowest when the population equals 0. Alpha and C represent the slope of that line I just showed. Slope of how the birth rates and death rates change as the population size increases. So if we wanted to interpret these in terms of our linear regression models we did before, alpha represents the change in the birth rate per unit change in population size. So how the birth rate changes as we increase the population size. C represents the change in the death rate as the population size increases. So we're using the same deterministic model we had when we use simple linear regression, where we have a slope, an intercept, B and D. And then we also have the equation of a line where we have our slopes A and C, and then our covariate is the population size. So nothing new here, it's just we're applying it to a new situation. And we have our birth rate, B prime, which is going to depend on the population size, and our death rate here, which also depends on the population size. Like when we interpreted simple linear regression models, our betas and our Ds represent the value of the covariate when X equals 0, or in our case, when N equals 0. And when N equals 0, that's when the population size is 0. And that's where we're going to have the most births and the least deaths, because there's the most resources available. Okay, now with B prime and D prime in here, we can see how we actually derive the logistic growth model. And all it is plugging in what B prime and D prime actually equal in our BIDE model. So here we have births, and here we have deaths. They both depend on population size, N of T. Remember before when we had delta N equals little b minus big D, little b minus little d for our exponential model. We have the exact same thing, except we have B prime and D prime. We plug in what those are, what B prime and D prime are, and we see that the change in population, we do some algebra to this equation. You could try working this out as an exercise at home. Results in the logistic growth model. So the question is, as a self-evaluation, could you do the algebra here to figure out what K is? K, as you know from the logistic regression model, represents carrying capacity. But what does K mean in terms of little b, b prime, d prime? You know, what are the values that go into K? K is a substitution for something here. So actually, what is K in this equation? Try and work out that algebra to see if you understand what K represents. We know K as the carrying capacity, but what does K mean in terms of B and D? Little b, little d, and C and A. Okay. Now, as time increases, and let's see, population size, we see that K represents the carrying capacity. And instead of our exponential model, we get this sigmoidal function that looks exponential at the start, it hits some inflection point, and then the population size starts leveling off the population. So this is one population model that includes carrying capacity. There are lots of population models that also include carrying capacity, something called a Ricker model, Gompertz model, many different varieties of models that include carrying capacity. And they're all derived from slightly different initial conditions. We derive this from the Bide model, where we assume little b and little d are linear functions that increase with population size. And that's how we get to logistic regression. Okay, R, B minus D is density dependent. We have linear density dependence. That's what I mean when I drew those straight lines. The population size at n of t plus 1 equals population size last year plus population size last year times something that looks like R, like we had before. But R is going to be offset by this equation, which is going to shrink towards 1 as n of t approaches k. So we can just see by looking at this algebra here that when n of t gets close to k, this is going to be equal 1, and then 1 minus 1 equals 0. 1 minus 1 equals 0, and then this whole thing is going to zero out, and we just have n of t plus 1 equals n of t. R0 is the intrinsic growth rate when population size equals 0. So you could think of it as the intercept for R. R star is a equation. It's the intrinsic growth rate, but it's also a function of population size. And again, this is going to go to 0 as population size approaches k. Okay, so you've seen these equations before. Maybe not in terms of how b and d change with n, how little b and little d change with n, and how that is how we derive the logistic growth model. Density dependent growth rate, R, is also a linear function that decreases from 1 to 0 as n of t approaches carrying capacity. So in this case, carrying capacity is 50. Assumptions. Logistic growth model is derived from the exponential model, so they share many of the same assumptions. We assume geographic closure. Remember when we first started out with the exponential model, we made the simplifying assumption that E and I in the Bide model equaled 0. Same thing for logistic growth, because logistic growth is just an additional extension to the exponential growth model where we allow flexibility in little b and little d. Okay. Now, no individual variability. Again, no variation among individuals of different age, sex, or genetic structure. We talked about why this may not be such a great assumption when we were talking about the exponential model. Okay, biological interpretation of 1 minus n of t over k. What this is an adjustment to R that represents the unused portion of the carrying capacity. It starts off at 1. So when this is 1, population size is 0. So this whole thing starts off at 1. When n of t is 0, this whole thing is 1. And it goes down to 0. So when population size is small, this whole equation equals 1. As population size increases, it shrinks down to 0. So it's a proportion of the population that is not being used. The proportion of the resources, for example, that are not being used. And we already talked about what happens when n approaches k. If n is much bigger than k, then this becomes negative. Okay. With our logistic growth model, we see how population size, the growth rate, changes when population sizes are very small. The growth rate is increasing. We actually get the maximum growth rate in our population when we're at this inflection point. So if you remember from calculus, you could find the second derivative of a linear function, and that'll give you the inflection point. So we could work out the math, find out what the second derivative is, and that's going to be this maximum value here, and that gives us the time period when our population growth is the largest. Okay, so these notes are all posted, and they provide some interesting examples of how this model works and what happens under certain scenarios to provide more details. And I'm going to, for the most part, just leave these up on Web Campus for you to review. I think a lot of this stuff is review. Like when we talked about an exponential growth model, there was slight differences in discrete time versus continuous time. As we take continuous time, take the limit of continuous time, that delta t goes to 0, then this model approaches if we take the limit of discrete time for time shrinking to 0, the discrete time model approaches the continuous time model. All right, so how do we incorporate environmental stochasticity in the exponential model? This is where we go from our deterministic models to our statistical models. And we can do that using a lot of the same processes we've already talked about. In the logistic growth model, we can also incorporate environmental stochasticity by allowing k to vary with time. And we'll see an example of what that looks like. All right. So let's think about incorporating these models into a statistical model. All right, let's see if I can see both of these. Let's start off with the exponential model. We kind of touched on this last time too, but so we have deterministic models for exponential growth. Where, let's pull up that model again. N of t plus 1 equals n of t times 1 plus r. And then we have, so this is exponential. This is a deterministic model. If we know n of t and we know r, we can figure out what n of t plus 1 is. If we want to add some stochasticity to it, one way to do that is to put it inside of a statistical model. So how might we do that? Can someone give me an idea of where we would start?
What was the question?
The question is, we have a deterministic model. We have the exponential growth model. How would we incorporate uncertainty in this model? We know that, we've talked about this before, that all of our models are wrong, right? All models are wrong, some models are useful. So we know the exponential model and the logistic regression model do not perfectly represent reality. However, they may be useful. But for them to be useful, we want to incorporate some uncertainty into them. Right now, they're deterministic. There is no uncertainty associated with them. We would like to incorporate statistical uncertainty so that they're stochastic. So how can we go about doing that? Using what we've already talked about in class.
Maybe one idea, this is probably more based on an R, but have a variable birth and death rate. Like, you know, it's not going to be one fixed point in time. So how does it vary somewhat?
Yeah, so birth and death rate, allow those to vary. Okay, so let's see, how would we do that?
You'd want to use like the standard deviation, right? Or our uncertainty intervals, and then use it for like a binomial regression.
Oh, okay, I think I see what you're saying now. So you look at a binomial regression with how many are born, how many die, and then probability of a success would be like the birth rate and death rate.
Yeah, and then you just use
Okay,
deviation for the upper birth rates and the lower birth rates.
yeah. Okay, so let me think about that here. Try and write this out a bit. So we have some total number of births. And I know I'm not sharing this right now. I'm just working this out. So we have maybe birth rates are binomial. And then we have population size, N. And then probability of success was a little b. Okay. Oops. And I will share this eventually. So, and same with death rates. Okay, yeah, I think that works. That's one option. It doesn't explicitly account for the exponential growth model, although it could. So I'm going to share my screen now. All right. So I think James, as we were saying, and Brianna, maybe you were on the same page as this, or maybe you were thinking of something different too. But anyway, this is what I came up with. We have our birth rates. All right, this isn't rates. This is the total number of that were born and the total number that died came from a binomial distribution where we have our or probability of success B and a probability of success D. This is not really success because it's a death rate, but we still think of it statistically as probability of success. And then we have our total population size here. So we have a total population size, and this one's not quite right, because our birth rates can be more than the actual population size. With the binomial model, this can only be a subset of n. So B has to be smaller than n. However, populations can give birth to more animals that are actually currently in the population. That one is, we would need to think of something else for that. However, with death rates, you can only have so many die that are in the population at the beginning. So this one works okay for death rates. So that's one option. Let me just skip to one example that I was thinking of. I mean, there's a lot of ways to do these population models, and some work well in some situations, and others work well in other situations. But when I was thinking of the exponential growth model and how we would incorporate uncertainty into that, we started off with our exponential growth model here. Now, if we want to incorporate uncertainty to that, one thing we could do is say, well, we have some population size, right? We'll call that n of t plus 1. And we have some overall process that's called our exponential growth model. And that is written out as something like n of t 1 plus r. But we know this isn't a perfect relationship. We know that no matter how good of data we collect, that a population is never going to be perfectly exponential. There's going to be variability in that. So it's not always going to fit on this line. Like the populations aren't always going to fit on this line here. So we need to add some uncertainty to that. Maybe we need to add some residuals to that. So what if we think of this as the expected value? So the population is following some expected trend with some variability around that. So one way to do that we've talked about is using a normal regression model, where this equals mu, and then there's some variability around that. Okay, so now we've incorporated our deterministic model, which was our exponential model, as a mean process, but we also have some uncertainty that's characterized by the normal distribution. So the way we've written this out in the past was y of t comes from a normal with mean mu of t sigma squared, where mu of t equals n of t 1 plus r. So now we don't have beta 0 plus beta 1x. We have this logistic equation, or this exponential equation that describes the mean. So we can incorporate our process models, our exponential growth model, into the statistical framework we've already learned about. And then we can quantify the uncertainty. So if the actual population size, the actual data were collected and they look like this, we can estimate what mu is. We can estimate what r is, and we can estimate what the initial population size is. And we can estimate the uncertainty in that using the exact same methods we've already talked about. All right. Any questions about that? It's becoming less and less acceptable in science to use deterministic models like the exponential growth model and logistic growth model without accounting for uncertainty when you're using empirical data. If you're just developing ecological theory, that's one thing. But if you're trying to look at data, it's becoming more and more expected that you quantify uncertainty in that data. And the way we would do that with this model is estimate what sigma squared was, see how far around that line is, and estimate confidence intervals around R. And we can do the same type of thing for our logistic growth model. Okay, now back to logistic growth. Okay, one more thing I want to touch on here is this Lee effect. This is something you may have heard of in an ecology class. And the idea behind an Lee effect is that the population really won't start growing until you get to some critical mass. That population growth is going to be very slow until there's enough animals in the population to essentially be able to find each other. So you can think about this with endangered species. Snow leopards come to mind in the Himalayan mountains. There's so few of them out there, they have a hard time finding each other and reproducing, so the population won't grow. And you remain at a very low population until you get to a certain point, and then once there are enough of them, there's more interaction and the population can start to grow. The Lee effect is just a slight variation in terms of the math that we've already talked about. We talked about reproduction declining as a function of population size. But what if reproduction first increased in terms of population size? So the only thing we looked at, let me quickly share my screen here again. So this is just, again, the Lee effect is just a slight modification of the logistic growth model. With our logistic regression growth model, we had population size, and then our birth rates decrease with population size. Now, what I just described for an Lee effect is first the birth rates stay very low until you hit some critical threshold. So let's call this our threshold. Once they hit this threshold, then they start to increase, and then after that they'll decrease. So an Lee effect, what that looks like graphically is we start off with a very low birth rate, but as the population size increases, the birth rate's going to first increase, and then it's going to hit some threshold that helps it maximize, and then it'll continue to decline. So I think I have a slide of this on the next example. Yeah. All right, so here we have per capita rate. This is death rate. Birth rate is what I just showed. With our, oh, I'm not showing this, okay. Anyway, here's what the Lee effect looks like in terms of birth rates and population size. And this is the mathematical model that derives what happens in an Lee effect. Okay, now I'll go back to PowerPoint slides. And these small differences in birth rates and death rates, these functions for birth rates and death rates, are what determines the different population models. Exponential model, logistic growth model, Gompertz model, Ricker model. A Lee effect model is just a nonlinear effect in our birth rates, where it starts off low until you get to some population size where animals can mix and reproduce well. And then after that, the population starts growing very quickly, but then you hit some resource limitations, and then the birth rates start to decline again. So this is kind of like economics, where in economics, they developed a whole theory of economics based on supply and demand, where you have supply curves and demand curves, and they result in all these different economic models. The same thing applies for population growth models, where we have birth rates and death rates, and we can derive all these different types of population models by slightly different assumptions on our birth rates and our death rates. So if anybody's ever taken like a macroeconomic or microeconomic or principles of economics class, you would see similar things to these types of models, and finance too. So all of the principles behind a lot of these different fields are very closely related. So someone who studies finance can easily study population dynamics and vice versa. All right, as we change initial population sizes, those have effects on what the population actually does. When you have an Ali effect, if you have a small population size, it's likely that your population is going to go extinct. If you have a big population size, that helps out a lot with that initial population. So when we're thinking about reintroduction efforts, we can develop these types of models to identify how many animals we should relocate to have a stable population or increasing population. Because if we don't get that increase, the population could just blink out and our relocation effort would be a waste. So they did this with sea otters back in the 60s when basically the entire Alaska population of sea otters were mostly gone. There were just a few small populations left, and they had to translocate a bunch of them. And they had to figure out how many to translocate. If they didn't do enough, they wouldn't be able to find each other and wouldn't be able to reproduce. Then there's these other things like genetic, lack of genetic variability in the population too that we're not actually considering. Okay. All right, that's my last slide. We have 8 minutes left. I don't know if I want to jump into the next, take a look at it first here. I think I want to hold off just to stay on task or on stay with our schedule. Are there any questions in this last 8 minutes?
Oh, I did have one question.
Yeah, go ahead, Brianna.
Now this goes back to what we discussed with the birth and death and the binomial. What other, I know that you said that I went one for birth. What equation could work for the births?
Yeah.
Something like Poisson or?
Yep, Poisson. Poisson could do it. Poisson works for some organisms. Now I'm going to get a little bit into details about statistical distributions that are not necessarily required for this class. So if you want to, you can just kick back and listen to this without trying to memorize it. But Poisson works okay for things like bird populations. When we talked about Poisson distribution, we talked about how the variance of the Poisson distribution equals the mean. And when you have a function like that, where you can't really estimate the variance without estimating the mean by itself, it has a very specific variability that has. So basically, if on average you lay 2 eggs, and the mean of that Poisson distribution is 2 eggs, the variance is automatically 2. So you take the square root of 2 and you get this irrational number that's like 1 point something, I don't know. And so it's saying, say you lay 2 eggs and the variability around that 2 eggs is fixed by this square root of 2. Now, birds don't really care about the variability of Poisson distribution, right? Some species lay many more eggs and many few, and some have huge variance in the number of eggs they will lay. I think wood ducks lay anywhere from 1 to 25 eggs or something like that. And you can't get that type of variability with a Poisson distribution. So Poisson's not always appropriate for animals that have a lot of variability. There are other types of distribution that have less variability than the Poisson distribution. One's called the Conway-Maxwell Poisson distribution. It's called an underdispersed Poisson distribution. So that's often used for reproduction. The other ones are, if you have more variability than the Poisson distribution, you could use something like a negative binomial distribution. That allows for extra variability. It's very commonly used in ecology for when the Poisson distribution doesn't give you enough variability. But there are a number of different distributions that you could use, three of which are Conway-Maxwell-Poisson distribution, the Poisson distribution, and the negative binomial distribution. And those go from being underdispersed, the variability being underdispersed to overdispersed, in that order. So I've used all of those distributions in modeling wildlife data, reproduction in wildlife data. And it's almost always survival. Binomial is almost always used for survival or death. Okay, any other questions? All right, well, I have a couple minutes here. Just so this is recorded, and if you're interested, I want to go through the derivation of the logistic growth model here. If you want to stick around and watch this, you can. It'll go into office hours. If you don't want to, that's okay too. You won't have to derive this, but it's kind of cool to know where it comes from. But I didn't do this beforehand, so that's why I'm saying this is optional. So it won't be perfectly clean, but I'll get there eventually. Practice my algebra here. Okay, so we have Julia, you may need to help me out a little bit with this too here. So we have, I don't remember how easy this was. N of t plus 1 minus n of t equals b prime times n of t minus d prime times n of t. This equals, if we plug in what this was, it equals b minus a times n of t. All of this times n of t minus d plus c times n of t, d plus c times n of t, and all of this times n of t. Okay. And now we want to get to we're going to get to the logistic regression equation. Okay. So we're deriving the logistic regression equation. And let's start out with we'll just multiply this n of t through. So I just redistributed, let's see, these through to here, and this through to here. That gave me that. Now I can rearrange a bit. B times n of t minus d times n of t minus a times n of t squared minus c times n of t squared. I'm going to factor out n of t here. Then we have b minus d. And I'm going to factor out of n of t here. And that'll give us a times n of t minus c times n of t. Okay. This is r. Okay, getting close. Okay, here's this last step. A minus c, so 1 we have to do some completing the square. A minus c. Oh, I see. We're getting, that's not. We're going to have to factor out an n of t r. And that's going to give us 1 minus n of t over a n of t minus c n of t divided by n of t times r. So we're getting close. We can factor out another n of t here from the top. This is going to cancel with this. And now we're essentially there. Where we have, this is the same, this is the same, this is the same. We have n of t in the numerator, and we have this last term, a minus c over r. And we know that has to equal 1 over k. So K equals R over A minus C. And that's the derivation of the logistic growth model. Okay, any questions about that? How many people stuck with us? Is it full screen? 8 participants, 6. Okay. Yeah, so the question at the beginning was, what is K? What does that equal? Well, we know it as a carrying capacity, but what it is our intrinsic growth rate when population size is 0 divided by A minus C, which is the difference in slope between the birth rates and the death rates. So how is birth rate changing with population size relative to death rate? How steep each of those slopes are. Okay, I have office hours now, otherwise that's it.
Have a good day.
Thanks, you too.
I just had a question, just off what you said. I was just curious. When you said that they use like genetics sometimes, like how do they even incorporate that into a model? Like they do genome sequencing and then they somehow account for genetic diversity and how it affects survival, or?
Yeah, so I mentioned genetics a couple times today. The first one was when we were talking about allele effects, when you get down to a population size, and if the population gets super small, I kind of offhandedly said that doesn't even consider genetics. What I was talking about there was like a genetic bottleneck. You get your population size too small, and you only have a small gene pool from which evolution can occur. The other one was assuming all populations are genetically the same. And that means basically there aren't, that all individuals have the same on average probability of survival. Now that assumption is much less violated because on average, I think everything's pretty similar, or not, it's not pretty similar, it's that they average out. There's good ones and there's bad ones, and on average you get okay assumptions. I'm going to go back to specifically where that assumption was.
And I guess I was just curious, like if people actually do the same thing that we've done and take data on genetics and then fit models to them to see if genetic diversity increases or decreases over a period of time, or if that's like not a thing people do.
Yeah, and I'm less familiar with genetic research. We have a genetic researcher who does wildlife stuff in our department. Marjorie Matoke does more genetic stuff. I don't know if you've had her in a class. So I don't know exactly what people do. I know some of the methods that people use in terms of the statistics they use. Genetics has a problem of high dimensional data where they have, we've been talking about one response variable, like a 0 or a 1 for an animal if it dies. Genetics, they have all types of response variables. They have like hundreds of response variables. So they have this problem they call big data issues. Big N, problems with big N. But anyway, people do lots of research and use genetics for a lot of different things. One thing is genetic diversity to look at that. And I'm not so familiar with that research just because I haven't had to use it yet. But the other thing they use it for is mark recapture and analysis, and they use it for like what they would do with forensic files. How do they identify individuals? And I am much more familiar with that stuff. But there is some interesting genetic stuff out there that some people in our lab do, and one of those people would be Marjorie. So if you check out her website, she would have some thoughts on that for sure. That's what she specializes in.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I had a question too.
Yeah, go ahead.
It was about the exam. I don't know if I can share my screen to show you.
I will allow you to do that. Just 1 second.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Video. Sorry, it's a little dark where so I would keep getting this message when I would run my models. I had sent an email on Monday. I'm not sure if you've seen it, but so I was working on it and everything was going fine. And then up until when I got to my last model, that's when I got this message. So I went back and reran everything, and then all of a sudden all my models started getting this message. So I've been trying to play around with it like here and there. And let me show you another message I would get. So I would get that message, and then I would get like these messages right here. Like I would just get like different errors, and I'm not sure why.
Can you go back up to the top of your script?
Yeah.
So the exam was, did you already turn in the exam?
No, I was the one who asked for an extension for it to be due today.
Okay, all right, right. Okay, that's right. Okay, so you set your working directory, load. Can you clear your workspace, that room up in the top right?
Is it this one?
No, it's to the right there. Yeah, to the left just a little bit. Yeah, that little broom. Yeah.
Include hidden audio.
No, you can just say yes.
Yes. Okay.
Now go to that one. So when you get issues like that where all of a sudden it works and it doesn't work, it's best just to erase everything and start over from the top. Now try running it again from the top.
Okay.
Just go slowly 1 line at a time. Make sure every line works.
Clear this just so we can see everything. And then these are just these ones, so I can just do that. These all run fine.
Okay, so okay, it looks like you actually tried to do hunting as a detection probability too, huh?
Yeah, and then
Okay.
so I set them all, and then here they start, and then like I don't know.
Okay, wait, go back one. So go back to the top one. On line 80.
Line 80.
Or line 75 actually. Try that. Okay, now scroll up a little bit. Okay, so that one actually looks like it works fine, right?
Yeah. So I don't know, it's like weird because then it like goes back and forth between models. Some work and some don't.
Try line 85 or 80, I mean.
So that one works.
That one works. Okay. Now your next one.
85 is
So that one doesn't. Okay, so what's different here about the last one? So it's something with feed time, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure because all I did was just replace time with sex.
I think the one that didn't work was line 85. I don't think you've done 90 yet. So 85 is the one that's not working.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure what. Oh wait, maybe
Yeah.
you don't have the in these both of these.
Oh, that's it.
Let me try again.
Yeah.
Oh wait, I still got the.
No, it's because you didn't rerun 72 and 73. You
Oh,
changed it, but you didn't rerun it. Yeah, that's it.
okay, so that one worked. That one worked. I just decided to copy all my hypotheses on a different one. That way I can see them clearly. Okay, I think they all seem to work. As far as the other message, let me go back to it. In case I get it again, I mean, I don't know why I would. But this one, what is it referring to?
That was because you didn't have that tilde in there, right?
I took this one the first time. It was when I first got it. But I did have everything in my, when I say everything, I did have all the tildes and stuff. But I don't know. I don't know if it was just my R that was like bugging out because I would get this message on some and then not others.
Well, it's probably all the ones that you had phi.time in there, because remember phi.time, you didn't have that tilde in there.
Oh, okay.
So whenever you have phi.time in there, it probably wouldn't work because you didn't have that tilde in there.
Okay. Yeah, is that what right here was this error and mark the calculator processed? Is
Yeah,
that
it says misspecification of model. And that's because when you specified your model, you didn't have that tilde in there.
okay?
Yeah. So that basically resolves all of your issues.
Yeah, everything started running fine.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that was the only problem I was having. But yeah, I don't know why. But like I don't, like I said in the in the email, this is another